All right, here we go. We're going to start moving into some Chapter 2 content on basic chemistry that you need to know to move forward in anatomy and physiology. This should also be beneficial to you for your microbiology class when you take that, and on into future courses you might take in the health sciences. And I do want to say up front, a lot of people kind of get scared when they hear chemistry, like, chemistry, no, I can't do chemistry. And, you do not have to be a chemist to make it through this class. If you're reading in your textbook is going to look kind of scary for Chapter 2. I'm going to be whittling down this information quite a bit just to kind of hit some of the highlights that you really need to know to move forward. So don't think if you're reading through Chapter 2 in your text, you've got to know everything in there. I'm going to be limiting that to just the core chemistry information you need to know to move through A&P and on into your other classes. Your textbook really has Chapter 2, and this is also true for Chapter 3. They've got a lot of additional content in there, and it's not there because you need to know every single little detail in those chapters. It's there because those chapters are supposed to serve as kind of a reference for, later, let's say you're in A&P 2 and you're reading about a glycoprotein or something like that, and you've forgotten what that means. So you can go back to Chapter 2 or Chapter 3 and look up whatever it is that you've forgotten, or maybe you've never heard it before and need a little background information on it. All right, so I'm going to divide this Chapter 2 content up into a series of video clips. I would advise you to, after you do each lecture or two, do your mastering A&P homework on this, because that's going to help you review and solidify some of these concepts in your mind. Then also within the learning module on Blackboard, I'll have some embedded review activities and some animations that you can use to help you quickly, immediately review. If you do that, that's one of the nice things about a distance education class, is that can help you solidify some of these concepts early on. All right, so our first little video clip here is going to be some really basic stuff on things like atoms and elements and molecules and so forth, and what that means. All right, so when you guys are in grade school, you learn that everything in the universe is composed of matter. Even when you can't see it, things like air, for example, is composed of various gases, which are a type of matter. So everything, including living things, are composed of matter. All right, and so all this matter in the whole universe is composed of different elements. And elements are things like carbon is an element, hydrogen, nitrogen, sodium, things like that are elements, and you can't break those down any further and still have something with the same exact properties. So that's what an element is. Each element does have unique properties that are associated with that element. Those include physical properties and they include chemical properties. Physical properties are just things that we can actually detect. So, color, odors, things like that. Those are the physical properties. Taste, in some cases. Chemical properties are how certain elements interact with other ones. Some things like to bond with others, like hydrogen and oxygen like to bond with each other. That's where we get water, H2O. And so different elements characteristically interact with others, bond with others more easily, and that's what's meant by chemical properties. Okay, so if you've ever taken a chemistry class or you've ever been in a chemistry lab, you no doubt have seen the periodic table of elements. So when I'm talking about elements, this is what I'm referring to. On this table, these letters you see are the symbols for each of the different types of elements that we know about out there in the universe. And so those include things like H is the symbol for hydrogen, C is the symbol for carbon, N is the atomic symbol for nitrogen, and so forth and so on. And if you check in your study guide, I have a listing. There are certain elements for which I want you to know these atomic symbols, like P for phosphorus, S for sulfur. Some of them are easy to remember like that. Others not so much, like Na over here. That's the chemical symbol for sodium. And you may wonder, well, where in the world do they get Na for sodium? That comes from the Latin name for sodium, which is spelled N-A-T-R-E. So that's where that one came from. Hang on, I'm having some trouble with my iPad over here that I write on when I want things to show up on the screen. All right, so we've got all these different elements that compose everything out in the universe, including living things like us. So if you take an element, something like gold, for example, gold is an element. If you were chipping away a chunk of gold, you would eventually get to the smallest particle of gold that's possible that would still be recognizable as gold. It would still have the chemical and physical properties of the element gold. So that smallest individual particle or building block of an element is called an atom. So you can have a single atom of carbon, a single atom of oxygen, a single atom of nitrogen, etc. All right, now atoms are composed of, they have a nucleus in the middle, and the nucleus on the inside is built of smaller particles. Those are called neutrons and protons. Hopefully some of this was ringing some bells back in your mind if it's been a while since you were in school. Hopefully somewhere in the deep recesses of your brain this sounds a little bit familiar. Neutrons, neutron, neutral, they don't have a charge. Protons are little particles that have positive electrical charges. And then orbiting the nucleus, atoms have other little particles called electrons. Electrons have a negative charge. That's where, when we talk about electricity and electrical charge, that's where that's really coming from. It's coming from these positively charged protons and negatively charged electrons that exist in atoms. So all atoms are built from these three different particles: neutrons, protons, and electrons. So what makes something an element or an atom of carbon versus an atom of oxygen or an atom of calcium or an atom of magnesium? It really just boils down to the number of neutrons and protons and electrons that you have surrounding an atom, believe it or not. So what I mean by that is a proton is a proton. It doesn't matter if that proton is in the nucleus of a carbon atom or if it's in the nucleus of a sodium atom. A proton is a proton. Same thing with neutrons, same thing with electrons. The thing that makes each kind of atom unique for a particular element is the number of those that you have within that atom, believe it or not. So all these differences we see as far as different properties of things out there in the world, it really just boils down to those little tiny particles that make up those atoms. All right, what are the most important elements for living things, including the human body? About 96% of our body mass consists of just 4 different elements: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Those are the big 4. Now, that's not all. About another 3.9% of our body mass comes from the elements that you see here. So here are the elements, here are their atomic symbols, and yes, I do want you to learn the atomic symbols for all these different elements because you're going to be seeing them all throughout your biology classes and then on further from there into the health sciences. So calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, iodine, and iron. And most of those atomic symbols are pretty easy to remember. You just have to remember Na for sodium, K for potassium, and then Fe for iron. So those 3 are a little tricky. The other ones are pretty straightforward to learn. All right, then finally, so we said 96% come from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, 3.9% from those other elements I just mentioned. And so where's that other little tiny fraction of our body mass coming from? This is coming from what are called, sometimes these are called trace elements in the body. So you may see that mentioned in your text or other things that you read, trace elements. All living things have trace elements that they require in order to be able to function properly. These include things like chromium, manganese, zinc, copper is another one, and there are several of these. And we need them in really tiny amounts, and we tend to need them for our enzymes. And we'll be learning more about enzymes as we get a little bit further into the class. Enzymes are like little tiny machines inside your cells that do chemical reactions. They build things and they break things down. And a lot of times the reason you need these particular elements at tiny, tiny, minute levels in your body is that they function as parts of particular enzymes that do chemical reactions that we need to be able to do in order for our bodies to work properly. So if you've ever looked on the back of a bottle of vitamins, or you're taking some sort of vitamin, mineral supplement, whatever, and you see all these things like chromium and zinc, cobalt and manganese, and they'll list the little tiny amounts of those that are present in that little capsule that you're swallowing. That's why they're there. Those are trace elements that you need in order for your cells and therefore your body to be able to function in an optimal way. All right, I'm actually going to stop that particular video lecture there. So we've talked about atoms, the fundamental building blocks of all these different elements that exist out there in the world. Next video lecture, what happens when you start bonding atoms to each other? That's where you get molecules from, and so we'll start talking about molecules and how they get bonded together.